Hello, everyone. It's really nice to see you in person after corresponding with many of you directly and sometimes with more generically over the last few months as we've developed plans for this gathering. I'll reassure you that I'm not going to give you a long address before we get down to business. I'm much more interested in hearing what you have to say about direct action and democracy than in sharing my own views about it. But I wanted to begin first off by thanking you all for being here. I'm conscious that many of you have made long journeys. I think people have travelled from 4 different continents to be here in this little room. And I appreciate you making that effort, sometimes at your own cost to do so. And also, of course, the effort that you put into your papers. I wanted to also thank the Gerda Henkel Stiftung, who has funded this wider research project on direct action and democracy, of which this conference forms part, and my collaborator on that project, Ian McIntyre. Ian sadly is unable to be with us, but is in physically, but will be here via the wonders of the internet. And thank you finally to Stefan and to people here at the ISB for so generously hosting and for contributing to the costs and the running of the event. So why gather here? You may be asking yourself to discuss direct action and democracy. Let me explain why I thought it was a useful call to make to others. I think it's pretty evident as we look around us, as well as when we look in the historical archive, that the use of direct action is a fundamental question for democracy and more broadly for the pursuit of justice. If we look around us, we see that direct action is a strong presence in vibrant democracies. We also see that direct action is in many ways a shaper of democracies. It's used to win and to defend democratic rights. It's used to challenge authoritarianism, and it's used to demand that overlooked issues become the object of public contemplation, of debate, and sometimes of collective action. But of course, the picture isn't one-sided because there are many critics of direct action who use their criticisms to justify often the repression of activism and the restrictions on democratic rights. So direct action, of course, has always provoked criticisms, often criticisms that have used the language of democracy. These criticisms have presented direct action as a threat to democracy, as an expression of violence, as a challenge to the rule of law, and as a means by which minorities might seek to coerce majorities. And these criticisms and these justifications and rationales have often been used by repressive powers, by elites, in order to stamp down on any forms of democratic participation. We see it all around us in the present. We see it in the United States as Donald Trump mobilizes the National Guard against protesters in Los Angeles. We see it in many countries, certainly in my own country of Australia, where governments pass legislation to restrict protest around environmental issues. And of course, we see it in deep controversies around the occupation of university campuses in many countries in response to the loss of life in Gaza. So I imagine this gathering as an opportunity to explore these tensions, these conflicts, as well as these possibilities in the relationship between direct action as a practice, democracy as a practice, and each of them as ideas. And when we planned this gathering, we wanted quite deliberately to have a diverse series of perspectives on the matter. So we deliberately solicited papers from a range of traditions and positions. So if you read through the conference program, you might notice that there are people from very many disciplines. Stefan and I are from history, but there are many people here from political science, from sociology, from education, from art history, from media studies, and from performance studies. And I hope that different disciplinary background will lead to a creative tension in the work that we share and in the responses and criticisms we might make. I also note that there's great geographical and historical range in the papers presented. There are case studies focused on Sydney, on Serbia, and on Senegal, as well as many other places that don't begin with the letter S. And there are papers that look at the very contemporary expression of direct action, as well as those that reach back more than a century. And of course, I think if you look at the abstracts, you'll note that there are different kinds of intellectual traditions being mobilised by different paper givers. Some people are using very much close case studies of particular groups and practitioners of direct action. Others are using comparative approaches. Others are adopting a synoptic gaze. And others still are working on a more self-consciously theoretical and philosophical mode to explore conceptual problems and debates. So our aim very much in hosting the conference is not to proclaim an orthodoxy on direct action, but rather to stage an encounter between these different views. I think a bit like the performance of direct action, I'm not sure what's going to happen over the next couple of days, but I'm sure that it's going to be very interesting and to promote reflection for all of us. So that's all I really wanted to say to set the scene. There are quite a few housekeeping matters. Always they seem to multiply as you get closer to a conference. So just a few things to mention. That as the papers show, with a lot of 30 minutes for each paper giver, we think that it probably works best for it to be 20 minutes for each paper and then 10 minutes on questions on that paper to follow. Because otherwise what sometimes tends to happen is that someone runs over time and then eats into the time of the subsequent paper giver, and then the third person in the session ends up under pressure. So if you go over time a little bit, you'll lose your own discussion time, as it were. There will be a conference dinner. I signaled that in the email. It'll be tomorrow night, and the cost of food will be covered for that conference dinner, but not alcohol or other kinds of drink. And I hope that all of you are able to attend. That let me know over the course of the day whether you are or not. We don't have a formal conference dinner for tonight, but a group of us are going to meet in the lobby of the hotel at 7 p.m. So you're very welcome to join us to go to a local restaurant tonight if you'd like. And of course, welcome to do your own thing if you'd prefer tonight. Teas and coffees are provided out there. Lunch is provided on the premises here. But of course, there are other cafes just around the neighbourhood if you'd rather venture out. Also, we've had a couple of cancellations or people running late, as is often the case. So actually, our first paper giver, Paul, who was delivering a paper on behalf of Enzo, he has been probably ironically, in some ways ironically, in some ways appropriately affected by a rail strike in the Netherlands. So he's not here right now and he's going to arrive later today. And we thought probably the simplest thing to do would be for me and him to swap. So he's now going to be in session 6 and I'll just take his slot and speak straight away now. Josephine Haglund was down to speak in our second session today. She has fallen ill and is unable to join us. So as a result, again, probably the simplest thing we thought to do would be just to move everything else half an hour forward, because it was going to be a long day and was going to end at 6 p.m. We're now going to end at 5:30 p.m. and our afternoon teas and our papers will just move forward by half an hour. And I've let Dominic Pinsol know he's going to be joining us via the internet, and he's going to be able to join us earlier as well. So hopefully that will work fine. They were the key housekeeping things and the issues I wanted to raise first off, but we're a small enough group. I hope it's going to be a very informal gathering. I'm wearing shorts to signal the informality. Are there any things that we've overlooked in organisation or questions people have about the next couple of days? Yeah, Alan.
In the story and saying about right reading and explaining. In the afternoon is the right thing.
So we can lower the, but at the moment it's okay, right? We can if it's necessary we can certainly make it darker, but I just see at the moment it's I mean yeah. So if you want it darker when you present, or anyone who presents, very happy to.
Thank you.
Can I just ask, is anyone not joining us for dinner tomorrow? Because we have to confirm to the restaurant the exact numbers today. So. Okay.
Okay, and then one final thing. We are just as a default recording the presentations. We wouldn't upload them or share them at all unless we had your permission. But if you don't feel comfortable with us recording them at all, then just let us know and we can stop the recording for when you come to give your paper. All right.
Great, and then I guess we start straight with the first session, where 2 minutes late. Otherwise, I would have said maybe a brief round of introduction, but I guess in the extensive program, you have the CVs of everyone. And then maybe when we get to the discussion, you can introduce yourself briefly who you are so that everyone knows. And then quickly look at the program to see who everyone is, because otherwise we will lose too much time now.
Yeah.
I will, as chair, remind everyone around about 3 minutes before the end of your 20 minutes that the 20 minutes are almost over, and then we'll see how we go, right? And I'm sure Sean is setting a model for everyone.
No. All right, make sure you start now instead of 3 minutes past. All right, so I'm very happy to be here and to share some of my research with you. I was planning, as you know, to speak tomorrow, but I'm happy to jump in with Paul, not here yet. So my paper differs a little from most of the papers today in approach. Most papers are in some ways an examination of a single historical case or contributions to clarifying the theory of direct action, as I think some of the other papers are in this morning's session. My approach is a little different because I'm going to adopt or offer a conceptual history of direct action and of its relationship to democracy. By that I mean what I want to do in my 20 minutes is to draw out the dominant meanings that have been attributed to the term direct action and to explore the conceptual relationships that have been posited between direct action and democracy. And I don't want to explore that at one particular moment in time or through one or two influential theorists, but rather I want to trace transformations in those meanings and relationships over time. The idea is to provide a kind of historical perspective on contemporary conflicts and controversies around direct action and democracy through this long-term conceptual history. And I've organised my paper in 4 chunks that reflect my argument. First off, I want to offer a study of the emergence of the concept of direct action and how that was initially thought to relate to democracy. Then I want to introduce you to a series of historical and political forces that I want to suggest disrupted that initial meaning and initial relationship. And then I want to suggest how a new understanding of the relationship between direct action and democracy emerged, especially from the 1970s. And then, if time allows, just make a few brief conclusions. So to begin at the beginning, the concept of direct action, as is widely understood, emerged in the late 19th and early 20th century, particularly, first of all, in France. And its emergence as a concept can be traced in a series of key interventions in programmatic statements passed by the French trade union body, the CGT, by a series of new newspapers and pamphlets that are published that bear the title Direct Action, and by a series of broader pamphlets and newspapers that suggest that there is a repertoire of direct action that should lay at the centre of syndicalist and anarchist struggles. And that body of conceptual work and argument emerges most strongly, first of all, in France, but spreads more widely. What does direct action first, how is it first used in debates when it first emerges? I've explored that issue in a recent contribution to the International Review of Social History, where I've argued that as first applied, the concept of direct action was used in 3 connected ways. First off, it was used to signify a strong opposition to parliaments, to politicians, and to what was called parliamentarism. Second off, it was used to endorse a specific repertoire of contentious politics that was organised especially around the strike, the boycott, and sabotage, and these were seen to be central to the performance of direct action. And third of all, when the concept of direct action was first used, it was used to signify a vision of political transformation. And in that vision of political transformation, it was suggested by undertaking strikes, boycotts, and sabotage, the working class would be exercising a kind of revolutionary gymnastics And through that process, they would develop greater strength, greater capacity, greater political self-confidence. That would allow them to undertake eventually a general strike that would lead to a socialist transformation and to the destruction of the state. Now, that understanding of direct action, those three connected propositions, as I said, I think emerges most strongly in France, first of all, but spreads transnationally very quickly. And in earlier work, I've traced some of that transnational diffusion and adaptation across the Spanish-speaking world, the German-speaking world, the English-speaking world, and beyond. What did the diffusion of this concept of direct action and its uses mean for debates about democracy and understandings about democracy? Well, I want to suggest that, first of all, it didn't really mean very much. Because most proponents of direct action didn't engage very directly with the concept of democracy. They very frankly said that they are after revolution, not after the expansion or perfection of democracy. And not only did they not talk about democracy much, rather talking about revolution, but they rejected some of the key principles associated with bourgeois democracy. So they rejected formal constitutional procedures, they rejected parliaments, of course, most importantly. Sometimes they said they rejected even the practice of politics. When they wrote about violence and practiced direct action, they were, I guess, ambivalent about violence often. Some of them emphasised that violence may not be necessary to a substantial extent, but others said that violence may be necessary, or in fact would be necessary as part of a revolutionary struggle. Now, I'm working with a very broad brush here, necessarily, and I do think there are some important exceptions to note. There were a few socialist parliamentarians in the early 20th century who talked about the possibility of combining working through parliaments with direct action. I'm thinking of some statements made by Jean Jaurès, by Enrico Ferri. I think that there was one notable pamphlet published in English by Bertrand Russell in 1919 called Democracy and Direct Action, in which he argued that there was an important relationship between the two concepts and practices. Remember, at the time, Russell had just been locked up as a conscientious objector. He was a guild socialist and he was a proponent of a non-violent approach to revolution. And he argued in this pamphlet that direct action did have important implications for democracy. He suggested it might be a means by which minorities might protect their rights against a potentially tyrannous majority. And perhaps more interesting for those of us who are socialists, he argued that direct action could also be used as a means to win greater self-government, not just in the political domain, but in the realm of industry and in workplace rights. But I think it's fair enough to say that that pamphlet really sank like a stone, and there wasn't much debate that it provoked. And the question of the relationship between direct action and democracy wasn't taken up strongly for a number of decades. But I want to suggest there were a series of changes and political forces evident from the early 20th century, which changed this initial relationship between direct action and democracy and altered the fundamental understanding of what direct action might be. And there are four historical forces I want to suggest that disrupted this early dominant arrangement. The first of those is misplaced revolutionary expectations. So remembering that as it was first presented, the proponents of direct action had said that this was a revolutionary gymnastics through which you would win revolution and undertake a general strike that would transform capitalism and end the state. Well, of course, that doesn't happen quite in the way that the proponents of direct action say that it will. Rather, the proponents and practitioners of direct action face severe repression, find it difficult to continue to champion the cause, or still less to undertake direct action. Not only that, but some leading spokespeople who pushed the revolutionary potential of direct action secede from the cause. I'm thinking of Gustave Hervé, most notably, who embraces nationalism, or others retreat from revolutionary politics to reformism. Rather than direct action leading directly to revolution, rather there's another dominant model of revolution that comes to hold most prestige in international debates. The Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 creates a model of revolution that wins the support of many around the world. And interestingly, Grigory Zinoviev, as chairman of the Communist International, targets direct action as insufficient in an interesting intervention in a letter to the IWW in 1920, remembering that the IWW had been outspoken in their championing of direct action and industrial unionism as a means to destroy capitalism. And in that letter, Zinoviev says that he, as a communist, and other communists agree that we need to use direct action to take on the state, but he says, quote, "The general strike is not enough." And he says the communists go farther than syndicalists or anarchists or IWWites because they insist that direct action, quote, "must turn into armed insurrection." And that idea that armed insurrection is in some sense different from direct action, and it's going to be at the centre of winning a revolution, begins to win increasing support around the world. As Enzo Traverso has argued, there's a kind of a militarization of the concept of revolution in the interwar years. So that's one shift that happens. The posited connection between direct action and revolution is undermined by what happens in revolutionary politics. There's a second shift, which I think is important, and that's the emergence of new political networks that champion new forms of direct action or new applications. So it's not as if direct action disappears, of course. It remains a presence in the labour movement, but it's also increasingly taken up by other social movements. So I want to identify in particular the suffragettes, the Gandhian movement for Swaraj, and the transnational war resistance movement as three sometimes connected campaigns that use direct action and argue for direct action in subsequent years. Now, each of these campaigns uses forms of the direct action repertoire. So they use strikes, they use boycotts, they use demonstrations, and some of them use sabotage. They sometimes use the language of direct action, and sometimes they also use an additional language that they connect to direct action. The suffragettes talk about militant action. Gandhi, of course, coins the new term satyagraha to capture his politics. And Pierre Ramos, the anarchist who's important in the war resistance movement, uses the term socio-economic action. So they all undertake what could be described, had been described as direct action. They all use the language of direct action and expand the kind of conceptual universe of direct action, but they also break with some of the assumptions of the anarchist and syndicalist movements. Most obviously, they use direct action to seek forms of democratic inclusion in the polity. Gandhi, of course, leads a struggle for Swaraj or self-rule that he describes as, quote, true democracy. The suffragettes use militant action and direct action, but they use it to win the franchise. And it's interesting to read, as I've done, the French anarchist newspaper Le Temps Nouveau in the early part of the 20th century, because they're full of admiration for what they call the direct action of the suffragettes, but they're bemused that they won't use this direct action to try and win admission into the parliamentary bourgeois realm. It's also important that these practitioners of direct action, particularly the war resistors and Gandhi, more self-consciously connect direct action with concepts of peace and non-violence. The war resistors, of course, argue that direct action could and should be used to stop war. Gandhi, with his concept of satyagraha, connects direct action to the values of non-violence, of love, of soul force, and of truth. So in this way, there's a new inflection on direct action that becomes more self-consciously committed to non-violence. So to summarise, I think these connected campaigns reshape or revise some of the meanings that have been attributed to direct action, stripping away its previous distance from democracy and showing that direct action can be used to expand representative government, to supplement parliamentary politics and to pursue non-violent change. There's a third shift which changes the relationship between direct action and democracy, and that's the very status of the concept of democracy. Now, obviously, democracy had been supported by many for several hundred years, but I think particularly in the interwar, in the latter part of the middle part of the 20th century, the concept of democracy is elevated further and is given a greater political centrality by many groups. There's many reasons for this, I think. Most obviously, the experience of fascism has shown the fragility as well as the value of democracy. In the fighting of World War II, the Allies have said that this is a fight for democracy. The Universal Declaration of Rights in 1948 of Human Rights has said that, that all have a fundamental right to self-government and to the suffrage. And also on the left, it's increasingly evident that the Soviet Union is an authoritarian state, so that socialists who are critical of the Soviet Union, come to recognise the importance of democracy and come to make democracy central to their visions of socialism. So in all these ways, democracy is becoming more of a central concept to political debates, including for the left. And that alters how social movements present their campaigns. In the years after World War II, they increasingly present their campaigns as defences or contributions to democracy, as means of expanding democracy. You see it with the civil rights movement. You see it with the student left that says they're trying to democratise the university. You see it with the early anti-nuclear and environmental movement, which presents itself as an attempt to green democracy, as an opposition to technocratic elites. You see it in the workers' movement that more strongly emphasises self-management and workers' control. In all these ways, democracy becomes central to the self-presentation of many social movements. And that influences how the social movements then talk about and frame direct action itself. Increasingly, when they talk about direct action, they begin to frame it not just as a contribution to winning democracy, but as a very exercise of democracy, as a form of democracy, so that the language of democratic self-organisation and of democratic deliberation is more self-consciously appropriated by the supporters of direct action. Now, I don't have time to run through those examples, but there's a few examples on the slide of different ways in which activists who are undertaking and leading direct action campaigns describe direct action itself as connected to direct criticism, as connected to self-organisation, as connected to discussion, so that these practices of democratic deliberation and exchange become increasingly to be seen as part of direct action itself. And there's a final series of forces, I think, that contribute to a changed relationship between direct action and democracy. And they have to do with what might be called the activist wisdom, the insights that activists develop as they undertake direct action campaigns. Because as more and more social movements from the 1960s onwards use direct action, they've come to insights about what makes an effective direct action campaign. And one common insight that gets shared across movement publications and gatherings and handbooks and manuals is that democracy itself makes direct action more effective. So activists learn that when they are able to share their ideas and perspectives, they're able to come up with more compelling and effective campaigns. They learn that when activists are empowered to act with relative autonomy and not to be controlled from the centre, they often are able to respond more quickly to opportunities and to threats. And they recognise increasingly that when activists are able to form consensus about their activities, then they can become more united and more committed to joint action. In all these ways, activists come to recognise that democratic self-organisation makes, or direct democracy makes a direct action campaign work better. So that in practice, these two concepts become increasingly identified. There's another insight which activists come to acknowledge or recognise, and that has to do with the relationship between direct action campaigns and the public sphere and parliaments in a bourgeois democracy. Because they increasingly, when they undertake these direct action campaigns, activists increasingly recognise that when you undertake direct action, you can often draw strong media attention, and that can sometimes trigger public debate on matters of collective concern. It's of course, sorry? Okay, great. It's of course Martin Luther King Jr. who makes this point famously in the letter from Birmingham jail, but it's a more widespread insight. Others also note that direct action is often effective, but sometimes it's not so effective, and of course that it's very difficult to sustain a direct action campaign over a long period of time. And the practitioners of direct action come to recognise that sometimes it can be used successfully alongside other kinds of tactics and methods, that it can create a space for moderates to do deals with the state. So all of those forces lead, I think, to a changed conceptualisation about the relationship between direct action and democracy from the 1970s. And I'll just very quickly, given I've only got 2 minutes, step through what I think are the 4 elements of that new understanding. Increasingly, I think direct action is seen not as an antonym to parliamentary politics, but as a supplement to parliamentary politics, as a tool that can be used by activists alongside other tools, including the parliamentary road. Secondly, I think direct action is increasingly seen not just as a practical intervention and a means of heightening revolutionary consciousness, but also as itself a form of communicative action or symbolic action, or what is sometimes called a socio-drama. So it's a means of communicating and contributing to public debate. Third, I think direct action is increasingly identified with the practice of a specific form of democracy, direct democracy. And finally, direct action is certainly not always, but is more often conceptualized as non-violent. So just to conclude, what I've tried to do in this very broad brush, very rapid brush through history is to argue that direct action and democracy are not unchanging forms, and to show that the meaning of direct action and its relationship to democracy has shifted quite a bit over time. Direct action emerged as a critique of representative government, and its practitioners at first sought a socialist revolution rather than democratic renewal as such. But over time, the practitioners of direct action although they continued to present representative government as inadequate, they increasingly presented direct action as consistent with democracy, as an enlarger of representative government, and as a form of direct democracy. And this happened because of historical forces, because of shifts in the context, and because of the activist wisdom developed in political practice. And I want to suggest that precisely because this closer relationship between direct action and democracy was the product of historical forces, it remains contingent rather than absolute. And it's certainly possible that the increasing closeness of direct action and democracy might be arrested or overwhelmed by new contexts, by new experiences, and by unexpected outcomes in the future. I also wanted to end by noting that precisely because it rejects parliamentarism, direct action will remain contentious because it questions the hegemony of representative government, and it implies alternative principles of authority, meaning, and action. That's it.
You said at the beginning, we'll have some time for questions that are immediately. We'll have some time for questions that are immediately related to the paper. More general points, of course, can then also be made in the general discussions. So, are there any burning questions that you want to ask now? If so, please remember to just state your name, please.
Yeah, yes, so 2 questions. In the introduction, you mentioned direct action can turn into collective action. From a conceptual perspective, when does direct action end and collective action begin? And secondly, for my own research, so you mentioned from the 1970s, direct action is increasingly linked or seen as at least the democracy. What about this interlude? So we have these 2 decades after fascism, where we already had the fascist experience, which have led to a revaluation of democracy. What is the status of direct democracy basically in the 1950s? Still a threat? Still anti-democratic, or already part of the democratic repertoire?
Thank you. So I think the first question, when I say collective action, I regard direct action as itself a form of collective action. Most people wouldn't really agree with that. So when I reference, I think in the introduction, undertaking collective action, I think I was referring to action, the action of the state in response to political performance. So that's probably a looseness in my own language, or a case of the term being used in different ways. So what happens to the questions really, the other questions, the historical one about the status of direct democracy as an ideal in the years after World War I, maybe World War II.
So not up until this big revaluation of direct action after 1968.
Yeah, well, I think as often with social movements, I think you find small groups and networks that are not very widely visible, but are fervently discussing these matters and beginning to experiment with these matters. So in an earlier book I wrote called Going in the West, that looked at non-violence and direct action in anti-nuclear and peace movements and Ghana's influence. One of the things that I looked at was how in the late 40s and early 50s, pacifist movements, transnationally connected, are actually experimenting with forms of direct action and with their connection to principles of democracy, often influenced by Quakerism. But these aren't publicly visible. However, they begin to have an impact when they're connected to wider movements in opposition to nuclear weapons and in support of the civil rights of African Americans in the later 1950s. So I think certainly that's just one example. There are the other networks and other groups. So I think these connections and practices are important, but are not always visible.
Sorry, many thanks for the presentation. As a media scholar, I have a communication point to make.
Yeah.
When you can think of every tactic or direct action as a communicative form. So if you go back to Charles Steele, he doesn't talk about communication much, but he thinks of tactics as the performance of plays in public, right? The thinking that's important. So I wondered about the conclusion that it becomes a communicative form, and I wonder whether it's always a communicative form, but it is perhaps a different kind of strategy behind it. So perhaps in the early days, it was a way to establish a revolutionary consciousness among, certain people, but now it's being used as a communication tactic. It's being used differently to sort of like raise public awareness and learning. So, perhaps it was always learning and form.
Yes, thank you. I think that's a certain point, and yeah, I would agree with you very much. So I do think that direct action always has a communicative element. What I was referencing was that this was increasingly emphasised by the practitioners of direct action. So although in practice, of course, when you the initial use of sabotage and the concept of sabotage touches off this major public alarm and huge amount of debate, and these early proponents of direct action not only are getting condemnation and lots of media attention, as well, of course, the suffragettes and all of these campaigners, but they're not always conceptualising what they're doing overtly as a communicative act that will play into these media dynamics. In my view, that consciousness about the communicative context and the communicative status of direct action that for most activists becomes more overt over time.
Well, especially, I wonder whether in the past they didn't talk about it that much as sort of like publicity stance, because the suffragists, for example, were great in the publicity stance. Even with the media all the time, they use, so that they knew they were getting arrested and had a photography place at the office that in order to capture the kind of arrest. So in a way, I wonder whether they are talking about the media much more right now rather than in the past. And that should like, because for instance, you think about pamphlets and newspapers. So in a way, they were working with the media all the time in the party.
I very much agree with that. And Gandhi, another example, who's obviously highly conscious of media attention, able to frame much of what he does in a way that's going to capture, produce startling images around the world.
One last question.
Brilliant talk, and I was interested if you could say perhaps a little bit more between the relationship between direct democracy as a more internal form of political action and direct action as something that is more to the public, and how you see the relationship between this more invisible direct democracy, perhaps, or invisible to the activists and the direct action.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think I probably need more time to think about that now. So with apologies. I think again, I'd say that certain kinds of political traditions emphasise the possibility of self-transformation through action as the prefiguring of a better society through the building of better human relationships and the sharing of decision making. And some of those political and sometimes religious traditions, extend back over a long period of time. And some of the activists connected to those traditions are important for direct action. So again, we see that definitely in parts of the pacifist movement, and in parts of the IWW also are emphasising the idea of prefiguring a better world through struggling and connection. So I see them. I guess all I'm doing is repeating back to you, but I do agree that that's a relationship, and it's an important dimension of the story. But I'm unable to confidently tell you when I think it was most important or how it became more overt. Something to think about.
Thank you very much.